Hello and welcome back to another lesson in Java programming. Today we're going to take all the object-oriented programming concepts that you've just mastered and we're going to apply them to a different context, because it's time to start to think about things like graphical user interfaces, buttons, text boxes, things like that, as well as drawing, graphics, images, animation. And we had to wait until we had an understanding of object-oriented programming, because all of this functionality in Java assumes that you know how to manipulate objects, right? And you understand classes and you're able to see the functionality of classes. And so there's a set of tutorials that go along with this video, but the purpose of this video is just to provide some theoretical background to how GUI works in Java. And this is applicable to many programming languages in addition to Java. So we're going to get you to a point where you understand how it works, as well as the tools that you need using NetBeans to accomplish those. And we're going to be using a set of tools built into Java in order to help us with that. Okay, and that's sort of where we're going. So we're going to start with just the general principle of GUI design. Remember, GUI now is graphical user interface. It's the thing that you see. Every graphical user interface has three common elements. There's the interface, which is the actual window, right? The thing that you see. Then there's the engine. The engine is the stuff that does the work behind that interface. That's really the guts of your program or your game or whatever it is. And then there's something called a listener, which allows those two very different parts to communicate with one another. Very often, and you know, game development comes to mind, very often the engine and the interface are very different systems programmed at completely different times. You have an Unreal Engine, for example, in gaming that handles the background, and you have to build the front, how it's actually going to look and communicate with that engine. And that's why they're able to build so many different kinds of games that look so different using that same engine. So this is the way they communicate, is you have the engine, and you have the listener, and you have the interface. And so generally what happens is some sort of a user action is captured by the listener. Oh, look, someone pressed a button. Then that listener will call a method in your code, you know, something to handle the pressing of that particular button. Then your code is going to return something back to the listener, some information, yeah, I'm done, or I want you to update the interface in order to do this, right? It's going to do code, return it, and then it goes back to the interface. This is a really different model than what you're used to. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So the engine, remember, a GUI is just a pretty interface. The engine is the brain of your application. Usually I will tell all my students, when you're given a program, build the engine first. The engine should be able to work independently and should have the functionality needed. And that same engine could be used for multiple different front ends or graphical user interfaces, or a non-graphical user interface, or a VR interface, right? It could be used in many different ways with the same type of engine. The interface would be like the body. So if the engine is kind of like your brain, the body, the outside, the way you look, that's the interface. How are the buttons going to look? How is someone going to interact? Is it going to be a button? Is it going to be a mouse press? Is it going to be a finger moving on a tablet? How's that going to look? What's that input going to look like? And how are they going to interact? The interface in our type of programming, which is kind of Windows based and on a PC or a Mac, is that your window is going to paint itself. And when you call a paint method, it's going to pretty up and draw all of the elements that you want. I want a button here. The button's going to be red. It's going to have this text on it, and it's going to have round edges and all those types of things. The terminology for doing that is painting. So it's not just painting like colors. It's also painting the components and how they look. And all that's done in that interface. The last component is the listener, right? And so if the interface kind of interacts with the engine, the way that it does that is through the listener. And quite literally, the listener is going to listen to a particular component waiting for something to happen. So let's say, again, we'll use the button example. A listener will wait and listen for that button on the screen to be pushed. And that's its only job, is that one listener is dedicated to listening to that one button. And when that button is pushed, that listener is going to go to the engine and call a particular method, my button listener or my button method, and it's going to connect to that method and run all the code that's inside there. So the listener gets attached to a particular component, like a button, and when something happens to that button, if it's listening for that action, it will take the appropriate steps by calling one method or two methods or changing some variables or doing whatever needs to be done. Okay. There's a couple of really kind of common listeners in Java. One of them would be a mouse listener, which is listening for mouse clicks and movements. There are action listeners that are waiting for an action on a particular component, like pressing the button, the act of clicking on the button. There's also keyboard listeners, which are listening for key typing. There are timer listeners, which you can set a timer to go off every 20 seconds, and every 20 seconds this listener will say, it's gone off, so it's going to call a particular method. There are certain terminology, and I don't want to go into too much depth here because really you're going to want to go through the tutorial and try these for yourself. But what ends up happening is you are going to add, the term actually is listener, you are going to add a listener into your code. It's an interface. And when you do that, then you're going to have certain things that are going to happen when that interface, when that listener gets activated by the interface. So let's not get too bogged down in this. I'm going to move on pretty quickly here. So again, the way that the listener works, the user clicks, activates the component in the interface. The listener, which was listening for that particular action, then gets invoked, and it will call the relevant method in the engine. The engine performs a bunch of work, and if it needs to, it goes back to the interface and makes changes to that interface. So it's a very defined set of steps that need to happen. So actually, you know what? Before I do that, I want you to think about this for a second, about how different this makes the way that you're writing code. Up until this point, you have lived in a world where you control when your code gets called and how it gets called. You had a main method and you said exactly what you wanted to happen in that main method, and it got executed in the order that you wanted to happen. You're moving now into a different world, and you're going to have to adjust your brains a bit, because when you start to use graphical user interfaces, you are losing control over the order that things happen. When is the user going to click the button on the screen? You don't know. It could be now, it could be later. If you have 4 buttons, you don't know which button is going to get clicked first, which button is going to get clicked second, or if any of those buttons are going to get clicked. And so the idea of having a main method that controls what's happening is out the window. The main method usually just starts up your interface, and then you are waiting for an event to happen, for your listener to get activated to call the method which does the work for that particular button. So you're very modular. A word for what we're learning now is kind of like modular programming. Your method may or may not get called. It's out of your control. It depends on how the user interacts with the interface. And you need to start to adjust your thinking with the engine to be able to handle that. And that's why you really need to understand object-oriented programming first. Because now that you understand how to build a class and how to build methods around that class, you can better understand how this works. Okay, perfect. So let's move on a little bit. There's a little bit more terminology. So every interface has some sort of top-level container. Think about it like a frame. So there's always a frame that goes around your window or your program. We're going to be playing around with just one kind, and it's called a J-frame. And that J-frame is what we use for our main window in a PC or a Mac type of environment. If you're playing around with tablets or you're playing around with web interfaces, you might be using something different. But for us, we're going to be using these J-frames, and you need to think of it literally just like a frame. It's going to hold all of the different components of your interface inside there. The J-frame is at the top, and then there's going to be a whole bunch of things that we are going to be able to add into that J-frame. I can throw in a menu at the top of it. I could throw in a label, which is just like a bunch of text. I can keep throwing in a whole bunch of different components into that frame. Another way of looking at it, hang on, we're going to skip over some code here. Another way of looking at it is that you have your frame, which is the big outside, and then within that frame, you can start to add different components to it. Now you can add buttons directly to it, or there's something that we'll be using quite a bit of, which is something called a JPanel. So think about this as smaller panels that exist inside the frame. So I have one frame, and I could have a panel in here which is displaying an image. I could have another panel in here which has a text box. I could have panels doing a number of different things. Here would be an example of a frame with a title and 3 panels inside it. So remember that this is called the J-frame, and oddly enough, these things inside it are called J-panels. Okay, so panels can have certain layouts. So you can say, I want to lay everything out horizontally or everything out vertically or make a box or things like that. But kind of understanding all of those different layouts is beyond the course that we're doing. You could take an entire course on GUI programming to get it right. So aside from the panel, we've got a bunch of components that make up your interface. And components can be things like menus, buttons, text boxes, text areas, all those kinds of things make up the different components. Here's a few examples of ones that are very common. So JTextBox, JSlider, which is literally just a slider that you can move around, checkboxes, buttons, labels, radio buttons, which are kind of like checkboxes, but you can only have one kind of checked at a time. And there's tons and tons and tons of components that you can add to it. Each of them can behave a little bit different. They're all components. They all have the same superclass, but they could all behave differently. And so if you want to use a new component you've never used before, you do have to kind of check the API to learn a little bit about it and how it behaves. Okay, here's some examples of those in the hierarchy. Right, each of these is a different class. So you have a JText component, and then you can have a bunch of subclasses that do very specific things. This would be specific for password fields, you know, the little starred fields that you can do. You can have text fields, you can have so there's so many different components that exist within Java. You're going to do a great tutorial that's going to give you a working introduction to how this works in just a second. But for now, what I want to do is just to kind of sum this up, because I've thrown a lot of things at you. When you go to build a GUI program, the very first thing you should do is build the engine. Those of you who are following along in my course, you have just finished a pretty spectacular engine, which is shapes. You have built an engine that can handle a bunch of different shapes and can do operations on those shapes, like rotating and translating and scaling and all that wonderful stuff. Build that first. Get your engine working independent of any sort of interface that you might want, because a good engine can be used in many different interfaces. Then the next thing that you do is you think, how do I want this to look? What's the GUI going to look like? And so that's where those components we talked about come in. Create a JFrame, create a JPanel, put some graphics in, do some drawing, do whatever you want with it, add that GUI layer. So then you've got the engine, then you've got the GUI layer, and then the last thing that you do is you put in those listeners in order to allow you to link those two things together. So I don't want to spoil the tutorial, but I do want to give you at least one look at how this happens in NetBeans. This is not a course on GUIs and graphics. And so what we do is we're going to use in a built-in tool in NetBeans that allows you to build GUIs very easily, like a drag and drop type interface. If you see making beautiful interfaces as something important in your future, I strongly advise you to take a course, learn about it yourself, but it's beyond what I'm teaching. I'm personally an engine person, so I know the bare minimum of how to make things look nice. And for this course, we're going to use this tool to get it looking the way we need to. So remember what I said, the first thing we need is a project, always a project. So it's going to be a Java application like everything else, and we're going to call it our first GUI. Oops, I jumped the gun a little bit. There we go. Our first GUI. Beautiful. Let's finish it up. Now, the very top layer we said had to be a frame. So we're going to right click here, we're going to go new, but we're not going to create a class now. What we're going to do is we're going to create a JFrame. Beautiful, I can do that. I can give it a name. Let's just call it new JFrame. Now you could start adding things directly into the frame, but we don't usually do that. What we do is we have a main panel that sits there, and it's really important that you add these in there, especially if you want to start doing graphics and animation, because you can't draw on the frame. You're going to be doing the drawing in the panel. So what we're going to do is we're going to come here and we're going to create another file which is called a JPanel, and I'm just going to give it that panel. To make sure that everything is right and ready, an important step at this point is just to do a clean and build of your code. Sometimes we're not going to be able to take the next step if we don't do this, to just make sure everything is compiled properly. So now you're going to see something you've never seen before. Look, here's my frame, and I've got a bunch of things on the side because I'm in the design view, which means that I can drag and drop things into there. You're going to notice that there's a panel. But because we customize our panels so much, we've created our own. And so the first thing we're going to drag into here is actually this panel. I can take it and I can bring it into here, and I can size it up the way that I want it to look. And so maybe I want this panel to take up this much room. And then you can start to fill either at the panel level or the frame level, you can start to fill it with stuff. So if I want a button in my frame, I can go ahead and toss in a button down here, and I can place it pretty much kind of where I want. Maybe I want it towards the bottom, and then maybe I wish to have a text field as well over there where I can type some stuff in. I'm going to line it up relatively easily. And so now you can see that I'm starting to set up my interface. I don't have an engine. I don't have any listeners. This is the new piece that we're learning right now, is how to set this up. The listeners, the magic with the listeners are going to happen over here under events. where there's going to be a whole bunch of different events that can happen. And those events may change depending on which component I've clicked on, but many of them kind of stay the same. And what happens is when you want to set up your listener, you can just click here and it will set up a listener for something in particular to happen. So for example, I want a listener. I know that for a button, when a button is clicked, it's this thing that happens, this event that happens. So I want to create a listener for that. I can give it its own name, or I can just select the default one. And you can see that I've jumped from the design view into the source view now. So look, NetBeans has done all this code for me. I don't need to know how it works. Look at it all. I'm not teaching you how to do any of that. NetBeans is going to just create all of this for you. But the most important thing for us is that it has created a method for us, and that method is going to get called by the listener whenever the event happens. Whenever this event over here happens, this is the engine piece that's going to start the call. The listener is automatically going to go to this spot in my code. So just to show you how this works, let's throw a really dumb engine thing and say, you clicked me. And so when I want to run this, I'm going to run it from the frame because that's the top component. There's my beautiful window. There's my button. I'm going to click on it, and right away it's gone to my method. What would you put inside here? Well, you would call your engine. Call the particular things in your engine that you want to happen when that button is clicked, which is hopefully more than just you clicked me. Remember that you can also interact with the interface, right? Once you do some work, you can interact with the interface. And all of those things that I added, all of those classes have been instantiated into objects. And maybe you don't know what those do, but maybe you can learn what those things do by following the interface that you know about. So I have something called JButton1. I can see that it's been created down here automatically for me. It's gray. I can't even change the code. What kinds of things can I do? Well, let's see. You know there's these setters and getters, so let's try with a set. Wow, there's a lot of things I can set. Anything that looks exciting here? Text. I can set text. So what happens if I go through and say, ouch, and put some code here? Then we can try running this and seeing what happens. So let's come over here. We're going to run. We're going to see our beautiful window. Oh, it's so beautiful. Gray. It's the best shade of gray ever. We're going to click here, and look, it changed. So there's what we've been talking about in action. You've got your interface that we drag and drop. That's all we're doing in this entire course is drag and dropping the interface. So don't expect, I'm not expecting pretty interfaces. You don't have to create pretty interfaces unless you want to. Then the listener, we created that listener through here by listening to an event and saying what method we wanted to get called when an event occurred. And then in here we decided what we wanted to do when that event occurred. Link it to your engine. Change the GUI, do whatever you want with it. And those are the components that you need in order to build a graphical user interface. And this also highlights the fact of what I was saying before, which is I've lost a bit of control. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if they're going to click here, click here, click here, close the window. I don't know what's going to happen. And so this is going to be a bit of a step, a change in programming. Just like it was a leap to go from using just the main method to using object-oriented programming, now we're kind of leaping into GUI and graphics. And the best way to do that is to go through some examples yourself and learn how to do it. And that's what's next. There's going to be a set of 3 tutorials that I'm going to ask you to go through. One is going to get you to build your first GUI. Then you're going to learn how to build some graphics in the panel, how to actually draw lines and add images. And then the last one is going to show you how you can add some animation using timers. So hopefully this was helpful in sort of understanding the basic structure, the theory behind it, and kind of a little peek into how it's done. As usual, if you have any questions, feel free to ask away. Take care.